Welcome to the Perfecting Crime channel, where we don't aggrandize crime. Nope, most of the criminals here are as evil as they come. But we retell true crime stories in an abbreviated way, focusing on the heroes involved. And then make an assessment of what I like to call the criminal's price of freedom. And finally give you available updates where they're known. Many of these criminals were convicted decades ago and have served their time. Some have been released. Perhaps some have killed again, or been killed themselves. Let's get right into it. Throughout mid to late 1993, James Boley poisoned his wife Donna with arsenic, slowly increasing the dose over a 5-month period. Finally, one day in late September that year, Donna collapses while teaching her middle school math class. The school rushes her off to the hospital, but the doctors there cannot figure out why she's so ill. They begin a, quote, shotgun-style testing regimen, trying to pinpoint something. Her husband James arrives at the hospital and receives the prognosis that his wife is struggling for her life in a near coma-like state. In fact, Donna's heart stops twice and is resuscitated and brought back to life through defibrillation. When Donna's toxicology tests come back, doctors see that Donna's arsenic levels were, quote, sky high, 420 times the normal. As a side note, did you know that it's normal for the body to have trace amounts of arsenic in it? The hospital doctors call the police to inform them that Donna has been poisoned. Police don't know if the arsenic came from the water supply, a student in Donna's class, or maybe the usual suspect, James, Donna's husband. After questioning James and doing an initial search of the Boleys' home, they found nothing, and James's story checked out for the most part. But back at the hospital, a nurse overhears James having an inappropriate conversation with another woman. Appalled, she alerts this to police. Shortly thereafter, Donna wakes up briefly in her hospital bed, long enough for police to ask her a few questions. But Donna is paralyzed from the nose down and can barely communicate, only through blinking and nodding her head. At first, Donna cannot believe police are implicating her husband. But with tear-filled eyes, Donna believes it's possible. She commented that James recently gave her an odd-tasting glass of milk with residue at the bottom. Police detectives interrogate James for 8 hours, but he has an answer for everything. He believes he's smarter than police. When they end the interview with James, they let him know that they are going to catch him and he is going to prison. But James literally walks out of the police station that night a free man because the cops and the DA just don't have enough to charge him. Shortly thereafter, police find out James has recently taken out a large insurance policy, more than $500,000 on his wife, and he's been having extramarital affairs. They ask to speak to James again down at the police station, and as they review the new information, James cracks under the pressure. He confesses that he poisoned his wife, but said he wasn't trying to kill her. He wanted to spend more time with her, and making her sick would keep her at home. Of course, that sounded as ridiculous to the police as it does to us. Thankfully, Donna didn't die, and she recovered. In fact, at that time, Donna was the first and only American to ever recover from arsenic poisoning, and she's made the medical history books. James explained to cops how he used rat poisoning to poison Donna, and then showed them where he kept hidden the partially used container at the house. In 1995, 2 years later, James stood trial for poisoning his wife, and the jury convicted him of first-degree assault. Since Donna lived, it wasn't first-degree murder. And an armed criminal action charge was also applied for the use of a poison in the commission of a felony. Both carried a life sentence, and the judge gave him the maximum for his heinous crimes. At 50 years old, James is given 2 25-year sentences to be served consecutively, 50 years in prison. Now, this is where most stories end. But I can tell you, this is where the story takes a dark and twisted turn. After James had been in prison for about 4 years, and Donna had made a full recovery, being able to return to her middle school to teach math again, James develops a friendship in prison with an inmate and shares with him his hatred for his wife and how he wants her dead. The inmate arranges a meeting with a hitman for James. The hitman comes to the prison during visitation hours, and James clearly communicates he wants this hitman to kill his wife and the prosecutor that got him the original 2 life sentences. He promises to give him $5,000 and even makes a small down payment. He explains he wants them run over by a car and left for dead. Unknown to James, the hitman was an undercover detective and was of course recording the whole thing. James got his day in court again, but after only 2 hours of deliberation in June of 2000, the jury returned a guilty verdict on 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentences James to another 30 years to be served after the 50 he already had. James will be eligible for parole right about his 140th birthday. He will never see the light of day outside of the Missouri State Penitentiary where he's serving his time. In one last twist, Donna created a website where she tells her story in great detail, has posted numerous newspaper articles detailing the crimes and her road to recovery. And you can even hire her as a motivational speaker there. Her Facebook page is current and she is a prolific poster. In the end, this is a story about a loving, strong, smart, determined, caring woman and mother named Donna, who survived not once but twice her evil husband's attempts to kill her. So what was the cost of James' freedom? Well, James could have looked at the cops and said, "Go find the person that's poisoned my wife, do your job," and then lawyered up. It would have been a reasonable response from a distraught husband. The police would have never gotten their confession. In actuality, Donna loved James, and though their marriage wasn't perfect, she never suspected he would kill her. If he would have dissolved the arsenic better in her milk, she likely wouldn't have recognized it and stuck by his side through the accusations. Both of these would have been free and probably would have kept him out of prison. But if we have to put a price on his freedom, the insurance policy was a flashing red light. Back then, that type of policy would probably not have cost more than $40 a month. The cost of 80 plus years of James's freedom was less than a couple $100s. And that's how that crime could have been perfected. Thank you for tuning in to Perfecting Crime, and we will see you on the next episode.